like a good crime, don't we? We all love sitting in front of the TV, watching the latest crime drama or reading the latest crime novel. I know I do. However, when crime occurs, we all hate it, and we want to make sure that the perpetrators are punished accordingly. Throughout history, society has had different ideas on the types of punishments. Some were lenient whilst others were brutal, but the main aim was to stop crime from happening. Welcome to Gavel in the Grave. Prepare for a journey of the evolution of crime and punishment. First stop, the Dark Ages. Someone's been scalped. Anyway. Blonde wisps. This is ridiculous. I'm never going to be a blonde. I'll take this. The Dark Ages are thought by many to be lawless. When the Romans left, Great Britain was invaded by both the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings. Both had similar judicial practices in detecting crime. These were known as ordeals, and there were 6 of these. Number 1, ordeal by cake. A special cake was made, and the accused had to swear an oath stating that if I did this crime, may this cake choke me. Then eat the cake.
No.
Number 2, ordeal by cold water. Here, the accused would be tied hand and foot. A rope was then tied around their middle, and they were lowered into a pool of water. If they sank, they were innocent, and if they floated, they were guilty. So basically, they were screwed either way. This method may sound familiar to you. It's how they tested for witchcraft right up until the 17th century. Number 3, ordeal by hot water. The accused had to plunge their hand into a pot of boiling water to retrieve a stone that laid at the bottom. The arm would then be bandaged for 3 days. When the bandage was removed, if the arm was healed, the person was innocent. If not, they were guilty and they would be punished. Number 4, ordeal by hot iron. Similar idea to number 3, but in this case, the accused would hold a hot iron rod and be told to walk a set distance. Number 5, ordeal by lot. Pieces of parchment would be placed in a bag, one saying guilty, one saying not guilty, and the other saying Trinity. The accused would then be blindfolded and asked to take one of these pieces. Whichever one they took, that was the verdict. And finally, number 6, ordeal by combat. If 2 people were arguing over something, especially if it was property or land, they would then have a fight, and the winner would be deemed the rightful owner. So we've heard the ordeals, but what happened once they were found guilty? Here are a few interesting ones. The penalty for killing a man accidentally by a tree was to give the tree to the dead man's family. The penalty for lying was to have your tongue cut out. Thorn flare. And the penalty for murder was to give the relatives of the deceased man money. This was known as a were-guild, also known as blood money. Doesn't sound fair. Now we come to the Middle Ages, where some punishments were used as replacements for those used in the Saxon period. The ducking stool. This punishment was often used on women who nagged their husbands or were found fighting in the street. The accused was tied to a chair at the end of a plank and were then dunked in cold water a few times, usually the local river. I think that would stop any tongue from nagging. On very rare occasions, the person would drown if they were not brought up as quickly enough. That would definitely put an end to the nagging. The stocks. For petty offences, the criminal would be placed in stocks with their crimes written on a board. People could then come along and see them. They would usually then throw something at them just to add to the punishment. Pressing. If you refuse to plead guilty, you'll be pressed until you confessed or died. You know what? I'm going to let this guy explain.
Morning, or afternoon, or evening, depending on what time you're watching this video. My name is Daniel, and we'll just keep it at that because there are some people who don't like me very much. Well, it's understandable, really. I mean, I am a torturer after all. Yep, you heard me right. I torture people for a living. Why? Well, because it's fun, isn't it? Plus, it's a regular 9 to 5 job, decent pay, brilliant perks. Why wouldn't you go for it? It all started at the interview, right? That I looked mean and ugly, and they went, brilliant, we'll take you on. Now, there are several things I do to people, but my main job at the moment is pressing. This is where we take a man, or a woman, we don't discriminate, and we put them between two boards. And we start laying stones on top of them. Now, when I say stones, I'm not talking little pebbles here, I'm talking large, heavy boulders. But we'd start with the smallest one first, which might be about the size of a loaf of bread, just to give the person a chance to actually speak, because that's sort of what we're after here. So I would lay on the first stone, and the prisoner might make a little groaning noise, like that. Then I would pose the question, do you confess to this crime? Now, at this point, I'm kind of hoping they say no, because if they say yes, then the fun's over too quickly. Then I would pose the question again, but lay on other stones, and depending on the answer, we could get up to 7 or 8 boulders on top. Basically, there was no way out except confession. Do you know what my favourite line is? Well, look on the bright side. At the end of all this, at least you'll be slimmer.
The pillories. The accused's head and hands would be placed in a frame while standing. Similar to the stocks, again they would then have things thrown at them by a gathering crowd. Usually just rotten vegetables, but sometimes, well, it could be absolutely anything. So let's jump a few hundred years to the Tudors. The Tudor periods were one of the most dangerous periods to live in, with punishments being handed out for almost nothing. There was also a few cruel punishments. Fighting in the royal palace was a crime long before Henry VIII, as it thought that any fight would harm the monarch even unintentionally. King Henry punished the crime by either a fine, life imprisonment, or having their right hand cut off. Branding. During the Tudor periods, there was no way of keeping records like we do today. So they thought, I know what we can do. We will brand people with their crimes. Ouch! Burning. Mary Tudor was known as Bloody Mary, not because she liked her steaks bloody. She actually preferred them well done. During her reign, roughly 274 men, women and children were burnt at the stake. So they would usually be strangled first. So it would be rare for anyone to be burnt alive. Sorry, I couldn't resist it. I suppose that joke was rather in poor taste. Sorry, I'll go. Treason was considered to be the biggest crime against king, queen and country, and the punishment was severe. Those found guilty of treason were hung, drawn and quartered. In 1998, this was commuted to life sentence under the Crime and Disorder Act. Although, funny enough, I don't think they were hang, drawing and quartering people right up until that point. Beheading was used mainly for the nobility and can be quite messy, like the execution of Margaret Pole in 1541.
Two seconds. Well, I didn't expect this sort of shenanigans when I woke up this morning. Bloody hell. Quite literally. First of all, this is one of my first gigs, and they gave me 3 hours notice. I think old Henry's lost the plot. He'd imprisoned a woman called Margaret Poll, who just happened to be related to him. Plus, she was his daughter's governess. Plus, she'd spent months at court, years at court, as part of his innermost circle. Need I go on? Okay. She was Catherine of Aragon's lady-in-waiting. Plus, never mind. The point was, she was Catholic, and a son who'd broken from the church and run off before he could be executed. So he basically took it out on her. End of. Well, not quite. She wasn't going to go down without a fight, or a half-mile bloody marathon. First of all, she refused to put her head on the block, so she had it held down. Then my first blow, well, I missed her neck and chopped into her shoulder instead. It happened. Then she jumps up. I mean, this is ridiculous. We're talking about a 70-year-old woman here, and she starts running round Tower Green. So, of course, I had to chase after her. So there I am, running like a madman, waving my axe. Alright, maybe not waving it. Have you felt the weight of that thing? Lugging it with both hands, and there she is, leaping like a flipping air through a meadow. Eventually she fell, thank God. So I lumber up and take another swing. But this time I can hardly breathe, let alone wield the axe. So again, I chop into her shoulder. She's screaming blue murder, so I take another swing. This time finally managing to chop into her neck. To cut a long story short, pardon the pun, it took me 11 blows to finish her off. But this time we got a crowd around us all booing and shouting at me. One of them called me a wretched and blundering youth. I'm 31. Yeah. And then another one shouted out, "Oh, she gave you a run for your money." I don't think I'm going to get many jobs anytime soon. Excuse me.
Murder had been a crime since ancient times, and usually the penalty was death. Although the Tudors weren't satisfied with just executing people at Tyburn, they wanted the bodies put in a gibbet for all to see, to warn people what would happen if they had committed murder. Now, you would think that suicide could not be punishable, both because you're already dead, but also because you're harmed no one but yourself. However, in those days it was considered a great sin to take your own life, because it was believed that you were throwing away the life that God gave to you, and this was of course an insult to God. The penalty for this was to be buried outside the churchyard, or at a crossroads. If you poisoned somebody during the Tudor period, the punishment for this was to be boiled alive, possibly because being poisoned would cause great pain to the victim and therefore the criminal should suffer the same. I think it's time to get out of here. Onwards and upwards, as the expression goes. The 18th century was considered by many to be the golden age of crime. It was filled with pirates, highwaymen and rogues. It also had the Tyburn Tree, but most importantly, it had one of the most bloodiest pieces of legislation in history, the Bloody Code. It was also the age of the Bow Street Runners. It was deeply disturbing that children was also executed for crimes, although this was very rare. The youngest boy was a 12-year-old called William Jennings, who was convicted of housebreaking in 1716. The youngest girl was an 11-year-old, who merely stole a petticoat. In 1723, the Bloody Code was established in Britain. This was a system where the death penalty was imposed for over 200 crimes, some of which were trivial today. In the same year, the Waltham Black Act was passed as an emergency measure to deal with deer stealing and other activities within the royal forests. During these offences, men disguised themselves by blackening their faces. It was sweeping in its scope, making more than 50 distinct offences capital crimes, for 7 different groups of offenders. I know, so listen carefully. The death penalty was given out to a broad range of other rustic crimes, like damaging orchards, gardens or cattle. Even if you just conspired to commit one of these crimes, you would be punished. Between 1750 and 1815, more acts were added to the Bloody Code, bringing the number of hanging offences to over 200. But it was a bit haphazard in its management. When a new type of crime was committed, the authorities scrabbled to pass an act that would make it a capital offence. Except that causing damage to Westminster Bridge had a different statute than, for example, destroying Fulham Bridge, but it was the same kind of offence. There were a whole list of categories from murder to stealing from rabbit warrens, but within those there were several individual offences. Arson had 7, and each of these offences had their own piece of legislation. I told you needed to listen carefully. There's going to be a test at the end. The number of offences on the Bloody Code eventually came to 225, but there's not actually any definitive list that exists. The funny thing is, as bloody as this code was, fewer people were actually hanged under it than before it. Juries were often unwilling to find people guilty, especially, I'm sure, for minor offences. Many would have thought this new code was just too harsh. After a lot of campaigning, the social reformer Sir Samuel Romilly succeeded in repealing the death penalty for some of those minor crimes, and as the century went on, transportation became a more popular mode of punishment. There were, of course, your standard criminals, such as your murderers and thieves, but the 18th century had a few special groups that were a little bit more interesting. Highwaymen, gentlemen of the road, often romanticised in literature. These include ballads, songs and plays, and often portrayed them as a Robin Hood-esque figure, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. However, most highwaymen probably never heard of Robin Hood, and they certainly weren't interested in helping no one but themselves, and they certainly wasn't the most romantic people. A highwayman was a robber who stole from travellers. They patrolled the highways on horseback, often robbing from stagecoaches and single wayfarers. They operated from the Elizabethan era right up to the early 19th century. There were highwaywomen as well, such as Catherine Ferrers, but they're often dressed as men. The golden age of the highwayman was between 1660 and 1714. Some of these were disbanded soldiers from the English Civil War and the French Wars. They were able to get away with this due to the lack of some sort of police force. Paris constables were useless and arrests were often difficult. Most highwaymen just held up travellers and took their money and possessions. Some had channels in which they could dispose of the proceeds, whilst others set up rackets on the road where the travellers would have to pay a ransom in order to go unmolested. Often, the reason why they attacked coaches was because they had no protection. This included stagecoaches and postal wards. The famous demand to stand and deliver was used between the 17th and the 19th century. Nobody was safe from these men. Even the Prime Minister, Lord North, was held up in 1774. The penalty for highway robbery was hanging. Some of the most notorious highwaymen, such as Claude Deville and 16-string Jack, because he wore 16 bright ribbons on his clothes, ended up at Tyburn. Those that went to the gallows laughing and joking, or at least showing no fear, were admired by the crowd. One of these men was the famous Dick Turpin, who even at the end of his life made himself out to be the celebrity.
Well, good evening, and what a glorious evening it is. I can see the stars glinting through my little barred window. Perhaps I should introduce myself. That is in case, of course, you didn't already recognize me. I am, of course, the famous Dick Turpin. Oh yes, that is me. I understand you might be a little overcome in my presence, but I assure you, I am merely just another man. A man at the end of his life. For tomorrow I go to the gallows. But I will go in style. I have had many visitors to my cell over the past few days. One of them was a tailor. I bought a new frock coat and shoes for the occasion. I have also, would you believe, hired 10 mourners for 5 shillings each. Oh no, wait, that's 5 mourners for 10 shillings each. Do forgive me, my head is a little foggy just now. I can't imagine why. They will walk behind my cart on my final journey, and what a journey it will be. I will look mesmerizing, dashing, debonair, the great Dick Turpin who achieved a bounty of £100, who survived months of hardship in Epping Forest, who led the brilliant Essex gang as we robbed our way across the home counties. Those were the days. Alas, the sun has set on those times, but I am still the great Dick Turpin. For now, at least. Jailer! Bring me more than wine.
Pirates, the suave gentlemen of the high seas. They've been subjects of films and books for hundreds of years. But who were they? The act of piracy is basically the robbery of the high seas. Earliest records date back to the 14th century BC, where sea people roamed around the Aegean Sea, stealing from ships. These people later became known as pirates. There is such a thing as privateering, where the state allowed ships to go and steal from other states. One famous privateer was Francis Drake. The main era of piracy was between the 1650s and the 1720s, mostly taking place around the Caribbean. By the 1650s, France, England, and the United Provinces set up their colonial empires within the Caribbean, where there was a lot of seaborne trade, just floating there, ready to be pilfered by men whose main job was to steal these goods. Men such as the infamous Edward Teach, otherwise known as Blackbeard. There was also Captain Barty Roberts and Calico Jack Rackham. Surely these men would put fear of God in any ship's captain. Apparently, Edward Teach, Blackbeard, was 6 feet tall, and so terrifying, when pilfering ships, any ship's captain would have surrendered. These men were eventually hunted down by the Royal Navy, and they were either killed or captured. Piracy in the Caribbean declined in the 1730s. This was partly because in 1698 the Piracy Act was enforced, making it easier to kill and capture pirates. But many didn't surrender and were immediately killed. One, Lieutenant Robert Maynard, hunted down and killed Edward Teach. Captain Barty Roberts was instantly killed in a fatal broadside attack, and his death was seen by many to be the end of the golden age of piracy, and make doubly sure the pirate safe haven at Nassau in the Caribbean was destroyed. If a pirate was captured alive, some would be subject to dancing the hempen jig, as it was called. In England, executions mainly took place at Executioner's Dock along the River Thames in London. Famous pirates were then enclosed in a gibbet, which is an iron cage, and there the bodies would be left to rot, which could take sometimes up to 2 years. I think this gentleman has been here at least 10 years. Although it was mainly a man's job, there were women pirates too. However, they disguised themselves as men, mainly due to pirate superstition, who thought women were unlucky. Some women, like Anne Bonny, wanted the same rights and privileges of the men of the time. So, we've been talking about state laws and penalties, but the pirates had their own code, the Pirate Code, and naturally there were penalties. For example, they weren't allowed to gamble for money with dice or cards. The lights and candles on the ship had to be put out at 8 at night. That may have been to keep the ship concealed after dark. Each man had to keep his pistol and cutlass clean and ready for action at all times. If you abandoned your post during a battle, the penalty was either death or being marooned on an island in the middle of nowhere. And if you smuggled a woman on board, you would be killed. If any pirate stole from another, they would have their nose and ears slit and be put ashore, where they would undoubtedly suffer hardships. William Deacon Brodie was born on the 28th of September, 1741. By day, his main trade was a cabinet maker, respectable businessman, and city councillor. However, by night he had a secret life as a housebreaker. He did this purely for the thrill, but also to maintain his expensive gambling hobby. As a cabinet maker, he would repair locks and other security mechanisms for rich customers. He would use this job to gain knowledge of these security mechanisms and copy their keys using wax impressions. Then come back at night and steal whatever items of value they had in their houses. This lucrative business helped him fund his second life, which included not only gambling, but supporting his two mistresses, between which he fathered 5 children. His first crime was in 1768, where he copied keys to a bank and stole £800. This was a huge amount of money, and it would have supported a household for several years. In 1786, he recruited in his gang 3 thieves: John Brown, George Smith, and Andrew Ainsley. Brodie's downfall began late 1788, when he organised an armed raid on the excise office on the Canongate, which failed. On the same night, Brown was approached by the authorities to claim a king's pardon, which he offered after a previous robbery. And Brown gave up the names of Smith and Ainsley, who were arrested the next day. Whilst in prison, Brodie attempted to visit, but was refused. Realising that he had to leave Edinburgh, Brodie escaped down to London and then to the Netherlands, with the intention to flee to the United States, but he was arrested at Amsterdam and shipped back to Edinburgh for trial. Brodie and Smith's trial was conducted on the 27th of August 1788, and at first the prosecution had no evidence against Brodie, even though his tools were found at his home and workshop. But with Brown's evidence and Ainsley being persuaded to turn King's evidence, the jury convicted Smith and Brodie, and they were due to hang at the Old Tolbooth. The execution of Smith and Brodie was on the 1st of October 1788, before a crowd of 40,000. According to one tale, Brodie wore a metal collar and a silver tube to prevent the execution from being fatal. Brodie is buried in an unmarked grave in St. Cuthbert's. He is the inspiration for Robert Louis Stevenson's story, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The 19th century was a prime time for crime. A huge influx in the cities and towns made the crime rate increase. It was the era of some famous villains, Burke and Hare in Edinburgh and Jack the Ripper in London. It was also where newly formed police force came into being, using brand new forensic techniques. Also in 1868, public executions were abolished. Before we talk about the villains, let's talk about the forms of punishment the Victorians had. Victorians strongly believed in punishing criminals, but before they could punish the criminals, they needed to work out what sort of punishments should be. Severe punishments such as hanging and transportation was one way they used to stop this growth of crime. But since the end of the 1700s, a lot of people began to be very angry about using hanging for petty crimes. By the time Victoria came to the throne, fewer crimes were subject to the death penalty, and pettier crimes had lighter sentences. Instead, other forms of punishments were being tried. These include building jails with reform in mind, and transportation was used in some cases to replace hanging. Transportation was where convicts were sent to the colonies to serve their sentence. But in the late Victorian period, this was replaced by penal servitude. Penal servitude was designed to punish the prisoner. This included hard labour, where prisoners were put to work on their treadmill or other physical duties while they were behind prison walls. Hanging was used for hundreds of years, and it was used usually for the most serious of crimes. At the start of the Victorian period, hangings were still being carried out in public. The short drop was commonly used in this era, which meant death was caused by slow strangulation, taking up to several minutes before the person lost consciousness. As time went on, the authorities started to realise that public executions did not deter crime and often encouraged trouble. In 1868, the Prison Act stated that all hangings must be behind prison walls. The last woman to be hanged in public was Frances Kidder for murdering her stepdaughter. As I said, the short drop was still being in use, but from 1874, the authorities were thinking at more humane and quicker ways of death. Imprisonment. So imprisonment is basically the removal of one's freedom, and it was used for many different crimes. Body snatching is the secret removal of bodies in order to sell to anatomy classes for the purpose of dissection. These people were often known as the Resurrection Men. Before the Anatomy Act in 1832, the only supply of bodies was from hanged criminals. However, this did not provide enough bodies for the medical schools, who needed roughly 500 bodies a year. During the previous century, this would have been okay, as hundreds of people were being hanged, but by the 19th century, only 56 people were hanged a year. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and the anatomists would pay a lot of money for extra corpses. Interfering with the grave was a misdemeanor with a sentence of a fine or imprisonment, rather than execution or transportation. So body snatchers were okay getting caught, knowing how much money they were going to make. The trade became so prevalent that it was not unusual for friends and relatives to watch over the body, until burial or even after the burial, to stop the grave from being robbed. This building here, in Edinburgh's Greyfriars Kirkyard, was built for that very reason. Other deterrents were iron coffins or graves that were protected by an iron framework known as malt safes. Malt houses were also used to store bodies in until they decomposed, making them useless for any medical dissection. One of the methods used by the resurrectionists when robbing a grave was to dig a hole at the head end of a fresh burial. When they reached the coffin, they would break it open, tie a rope round the corpse's neck, and drag it out that way. When people think about Burke and Hare, they instantly think of body snatchers. But this is a common misconception. Yes, they did try to get into this trade, but found it too difficult and so opted to murder their victims instead. Over 10 months, in 1868, they murdered 16 people and sold the bodies to Dr. Robert Knox for his anatomy classes. At the time, Edinburgh was the leading centre for anatomical studies. Scottish law stated that the only bodies that were used for research purposes were those that died in prison, died from suicide, or foundlings or orphanages. The shortage of bodies, as I said earlier, drove to the rise of body snatching. But when one of Hare's lodgers died, he turned to his friend Burke for advice. Burke promptly decided to sell the body to Dr. Robert Knox. Through this door here was the original mortuary entrances, where Burke and Hare sold their bodies. They continued their murder spree until one of the lodgers found the body of the last victim, Margaret Doherty, and called the police. However, it could not be proved that Burke and Hare actually killed her. In the end, Hare was given a deal that offered him immunity if he gave King evidence. Hare confessed to everything, and charges were laid against Burke and his wife for 3 of the murders. Burke was found guilty of one of the murders and sentenced to hang. His wife was acquitted on all 3 murders. Burke was hanged soon after and his body given to the university for dissection. As a matter of fact, his skeleton still hangs at the Museum of Surgery in Edinburgh. Jack the Ripper, one of the most famous English unsolved crimes. The murders took place between August and November 1888. There are 5 known victims of Jack the Ripper. These victims are known collectively as Canonical 5. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. All these women were brutally and savagely murdered. There have been a number of suspects and theories of who Jack the Ripper was, even some motives. But what is known is that the culprit had some sort of medical knowledge, because some of the victims had their organs removed. So finally, we come to the 20th century. During this time, prisons became the main form of punishment. By this time, transportation has ended. The use of corporal punishments such as flogging was used less and less, and was eventually abolished in 1948. The death penalty was also finally abolished completely in 1964. So, there you have it, the evolution of crime and punishment. However, this is not the complete picture. There are many areas where I will be exploring in up and coming episodes. So look out for those, but for now I am going to get myself a well-deserved drink. See you soon. Can I have some of that cake now? Piracy in the Caribbean declined in the 1930s. We all love a good crime. The penalty for lying was to have your tongue cut out. I forgot the date. Due to hang at the old toll booth. One of these men, of course, was the famous Dick Turpin, and even then, what was the...
Okay. She was Catherine Aragon's first wife. I will look mesmerising, dashing, debonair, the great Dick Turpin who achieved a bounty of £100, who...
We might have to just break. As I said, the short chart. The penalty for lying was to have your cunt